Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Manara Podcast. And in this episode, I'm joined by two guests, Zan and Hasan. Zan, of course, a regular with us, and Hasan, a newcomer. And we have a very interesting topic of discussion, inshallah, today. So, basically touching on Islam in Russia, and not only Russia, but talking about the Northern Caucasus, how Islam came to be in there, the history, as well as, I suppose, more current events as well. As part of that region and Russia as well by extension. So, yeah, we'll just get straight into it, inshallah. So, Hasan, since you're kind of our main, focal point for this knowledge today, do you want to just kick us off, like explain kind of where you're from and how that ties into, the region?
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Thanks for having me on, guys. Hopefully have a fruitful discussion for ourselves and for the viewers, inshallah. So, as you mentioned, my name is Hasan, and I am from a small republic in the North Caucasus called Ingushetia. Now, and a lot of people may not be so familiar with Ingushetia per se, but there are obviously the more popular republics along beside it. There's likes of Chechnya, Dagestan, obviously, a lot of athletes like Khabib, Khamzat, really put the name out there, and a lot of people have become familiar with the region. But Ingushetia, in comparison, is a lot smaller, and obviously being a lot smaller, not as many people, so you don't come across them as much. And the Caucasus, it's obviously quite an interesting place. Geographically, it's always been a strategic point, a strategic point of desire for many empires. Obviously nowadays we have Russia. Before that, the Soviet Union. We had the Persians there, the Khazar Empire. We had the Alans. We had the Muslims and the Arabs. We had the Ottomans, and it's always been a very valuable place strategically, because it is, as they call it, the gateway, or one of the gateways between Europe and Asia, or Europe and the Middle East. And because of that, obviously, there's a lot of history there, a lot of mixing, a lot of conflict, between colonizers and locals, between different empires. And so, inshallah, hopefully we were able to touch on some of those points. And as you are probably aware, most of the people in the North Caucasus, like myself, would be Muslim. So Chechens, the Ingush, the Dagestanis, the Cherkess, they're all majority Muslim. And because of that, obviously that, is quite relevant for us as Muslims. I don't think if they weren't Muslim, we would be talking about it here today. And then obviously the South Caucasus is different. But in terms of geography, obviously on the Southern Caucasus, we have independent nations, independent states. We have Georgia. We have the likes of Azerbaijan, Armenia. On the, let's say, the southwest, we have Turkey's right there. We have Iran's nearby. Below Georgia, Azerbaijan, we have, Syria, and the Middle East is right there straight away. So that's on that side. And we have the middle is just called the Central Caucasus. It's the mountain. It's the dividing line between north and south. And then we have the North Caucasus. We have the lowlands where, all of the Chechens, Dagestanis, all these different ethnicities, they live there. And then, just the plains, and obviously going up north towards the entrance into the Caucasus. Myself, being Ingush, first of all, just before I move on there's obviously, like I said, many different ethnicities.
Yeah.
Chechens and Ingush people, they fall under one ethnicity. They fall under this called Vainakh, right? Vainakh in our language means our, Vai means our, Nakh means people. And so that's why you see Chechens and English a lot of times. Me, myself, when I don't want to go into the whole spiel of explaining, English is this and that, I just say I'm Chechen. Because we fall under one ethnicity. My tribe, for example, Sichuan tribe falls under both, Ingush and Chechen. So, for example, there are some people here that would be my tribe, but he identifies as a Chechen per se, or he grew up in some Chechen village, and his fathers are from those lands. And then you have English on the other side as well, like myself.
And is that quite common? You think that a lot of English, just to save time, they'll just call themselves Chechen because they realize like a lot of people don't really know about them.
Yeah, exactly. Like, there's not many of us. Like, the population of Chechen, for example, is like what in Chechen alone is like 1.5 million, and then you have a lot of the diasporas across Europe and America and so on. So people are quite familiar with it, whereas English probably like 3 times as less, maybe even more.
Right.
So we just say sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'm Chechen. I don't want to.
And you think generally there's like a lot of homogeneity or continuity between the two groups, almost like to such an extent that they are one group of people. Like, is intermarriage quite common? And do they consider? Do you think there's a strong sense that we're the same thing?
I would say. So what you need to understand, Vainach society, right?
Yeah.
Is these English borders, these Chechen borders? These are a modern construct, right? More of a divide and conquer type thing. Society was tribal, right? Society existed as tribes. You had the elders, and you had the tribe in their own village, somewhere in the mountains, isolated. And there's also a lot of conflict between the different tribes, obviously intertribal marriages and so on. But society existed in a tribal form. This whole notion of a Chechen nation, English nation, is modern. It's a new thing. Do you get me? And like I said, hopefully, inshallah, we'll dive into it a bit further. But this is just a ruse by the Russians to separate us, to cause conflict between us. Because when we were divided, obviously, we were weaker. Less problems for them.
Exactly that. And can I ask on that exact point, what are relations like between the different Muslim groups that you mentioned? We've got the different types of Dagestanis, like Avars. I think Habib is an Avar. That's correct.
Yeah.
And you've got what are those relations like? Is there a sense of outside of just the Vainaks, is there a strong sense of communal Muslim feeling among them? Obviously myself and Abir are Pakistanis. We'd probably say that that's something we can be lacking on in the Indian subcontinent at times. Because we have a lot of different ethnicities and groups and persuasions in the Indian subcontinent and Muslims. So we know there's a sense of communalness, but not the ideal type, if that makes sense. Yeah.
One of obviously the differences, first of all, between the Chechen English people and the Dagestanis is let's call it variation. In Chechen English, you only get Vainachs, like as in you don't have any other ethnicities. Because we were so deep in the mountains, we didn't really mix, right? Whereas Dagestanis, for example, there are so many different ethnicities, so many different languages, at least 40 different languages, they say. You have the Avars, like you mentioned, Habib and them, they're the majority in Dagestan. You have Lizgins, Islam Makhachev, if you know him, another athlete, very popular. Dargins, Kumiks, all of these different, they call them ethnicities with their own languages. And so Dagestan is different in that sense, and they've come to obviously, live together, and they're not as, let's call it, tribal as the Chechens and the English. The thing is with us as well, we, I don't know, maybe you've noticed coming across some of them here in Ireland or in Europe, we kind of tend to stick to ourselves.
Yeah, sort of insular.
Really kind of like a herd mentality. Like if you ever go to, I'm sure, Zan, you've been to Egypt, you've seen the Chechens there, they typically will stick together. They'll interact with you, they'll be nice, but
yeah, of course,
it's difficult to get in.
Yeah, no, you go to certain mosques in Egypt, you'll just see everyone coming out, but then you'll just see like tall, dangerous looking fellas all coming together in a circle, very clearly their own little subgroup. And those are usually the Chechens English.
Yeah, I would say, But, I'd say, like, for me personally, a lot of people here in Europe as well, there is that sense of brotherhood. I'd say the more religious they are, the stronger that sense of brotherhood is. Where you're like, okay, this is our brother, this is our neighbor, this is our
amongst each other.
Yeah, exactly. And to a wider extent, it would actually be, I'd call it Russian speaking. So a lot of time the Chechens you see will mix with the Central Asians, the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, the
Exactly.
Kyrgyz people, because obviously there
Yeah.
is the commonality, Russia language as well, common language. We all speak Russian. So there is that sense. But like I said, I find it more often than not, it would be associated with a stronger or more religiosity, I'd say. That's just
Right.
from my experience. I could be wrong, obviously.
You associate that brotherly energy with like religious energy, you know?
Yeah. I feel like because obviously the religion commands us to abandon this sort of ignorance of nationality or whatever it may be. Islam first, brotherhood first. Because of that, you would obviously not see that nationalism, that superiority, that supremacist kind of mentality, which, without the religion, there's something that we kind of see often within the Chechen and English. We're obviously quite prideful, warrior-like, very confident in ourselves, tend to not submit to any people, unruly, always been an issue for the many empires, and because of that comes with ego. A lot of ego, if I'm being honest. But the religion, Islam, calms us down. I feel like this is just my own observation. It does calm us down.
Encourages moderation.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. No, exactly that, and it's interesting that you relate Islam to a feeling of brotherly energy, because I suppose it's that communal feeling and brotherly feeling is something that's quite traditional, and I guess if these are Muslim peoples, then the tradition is going to be steeped in Islam, and if you're far from Islam, then you're to a certain extent you're far from your own tradition, and you're going to be far from the ideas and feelings that encourage a sense of community and continuity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it is interesting, kind of how you're saying as well, in terms of despite, I suppose, the efforts of kind of dividing that region to these kind of nations, you don't have kind of, at least what it sounds like to me, a very, very strong nationalistic identity. There's more, the pride comes from more in just their ethnicity, their tribe, and of course the religion, because that can be something that you don't see as much. Nationalistic tendencies are very strong, I think, in other parts of the Muslim world. I'd say a lot of the Arab countries, and certainly in the Indian subcontinent as well. I think so. I think Zan, you would probably agree. Like Pakistani and Bengali nationalism, for example, can be very, very strong. And so for yourself, I suppose what I'd be curious about, and I think a lot of people would be curious about, is how did Islam come into the region? I know you mentioned like the Southern Caucasus. You probably would have had much more mixing and interaction with Muslim empires and so on, especially with the proximity of the likes of Syria, Turkey, and so on. But I suppose, how did it then delve into the Northern Caucasus?
Yeah. So obviously, as we know, the early conquests of the Rashidun, the Russian Caliphate, obviously defeating the Byzantines, taking over large parts of Sham and the Levant, and the significance of that is not only obviously taking the land itself and the Philistine and Jerusalem and the Holy City and whatnot, but the gateways it opens, because once you kind of get into that Sham Levant area, you start to have a lot of directions, whereas on the Arabian Peninsula you kind of pin in there and you have to kind of, the only way is up if you're not going across the water. But once they get to kind of the Sham and they kind of take over that area, you start have options. You can go into Anatolia, you can start going out to Persia, you can go into Africa through the Sinai, or you can go through the Caucasus. So the Muslims got to the Caucasus, quite early, once they kind of established in Sham and Damascus. They start sending, continue, obviously, before the expansion of the Muslim empire into that region, the Byzantines were the dominant force there, right? The Byzantines and the Sassanids, right? The Byzantines controlled parts of Armenia, which, as I mentioned, is southern Caucasus, Georgia, kind of those areas. And obviously there's no kind of natural barrier. There's no mountains, large mountains that kind of stop you from proceeding into those areas. So once they kind of, like I mentioned, establish themselves in Sham, they start moving up towards, Armenia, coming up to the mountains, Georgia, Azerbaijan, those areas, right? And we're talking as early as like the time of Uthman, radiallahu an, where we saw expeditions into Byzantine Armenia. There's a few generals there. Habib ibn Maslama, he was a general during the time of the early days of Uthman under Muawiyah, and he kind of started that expedition, taking on the Byzantines and the Armenians. And the thing with, as I mentioned, the geography, right? You have the southern Caucasus, you have the mountains, right? That, let's call it Central Caucasus, and then you have the north, the lowlands of the north. Yeah. The thing with mountains, as we know, they're a natural barrier. It's not easy to move through a mountain range, especially with an army. You have supply carriages, animals, livestock,
provisions,
soldiers. It's difficult, obviously, right?
Resource. You cannot. It might be, today it might seem like, you can just go wherever you want in the world. We have to appreciate back then that geography had a real effect on the direction of history, the evolution of culture and identity, and even religion at times. So it's I really appreciate you keep mentioning the importance of geography, because it's totally true. In Ireland, for example, where we all grew up, the reason why they worshipped pagan forest gods was because all they had around them was forest. In Central Asia, they believed in Tengu, the sky god, because they just had mountains and sky. So I'm not saying that's relevant here. I'm just saying geography has such an effect.
No, that is relevant. Because same thing in the before Islam came, the dominant kind of belief system was that kind of pagan, that sun, that the moon, the mountain, that type of thing. So we did have those pagan beliefs before Islam, and even long after as well, I would say. So as I mentioned, the mountains are there. There's only a few natural passes, right? You can't go through the mountains. There is one pass, it's called the Georgia Military Road. But the main passage that has always been used and is this place in the south of Dagestan, right? So between, as I mentioned, there's the mountains, you have the Black Sea, you have the Caspian Sea. There's a small pass on the Caspian Sea side, right? And there's a city built there. It's called Derbent. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's called Derbent. Derbent is an interesting place. Derbent is actually one of the longest continuously inhabited places in the world.
Okay, wow.
They say that people have been living there for around 5,000 years at least, continuously. Right? There are, obviously because of its strategic location, it's the only pass in through the Caucasus. You have the sea on one side, you have the mountains on one side, and they've kind of nested themselves right there in the middle and fortified themselves, right? So
what country is that in today?
It's in Dagestan.
Okay, interesting.
It's in Dagestan, right? And obviously, you have a lot of people passing through there. You have armies and empires, traders, religious people, kind of trying to spread their religion. Let's call them evangelicals or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
And because that's always been sort of a melting pot, right? Different cultures, different types of people, different types of religions. But that place, like I mentioned, the conquest of the early Muslims, they reached that place, Derbent. And there was a specific figure. His name was Salman ibn Rabi. He was the governor. He was a military governor under Uthman, and he kind of joined up with the Salman. What's his name? Habib ibn Maslama. They kind of continued that conquest. He supported him out of Kufa. He was based in Kufa. He went out to support him. They got to Derbent. And that's kind of that point, I would say, is the introduction of Islam into the North Caucasus. Because once they get through Derbent, they're into the North Caucasus. And obviously, they eventually took that city. And interesting point about Derbent is that there's actually the grave. This is how early Islam got to that region. There is a graveyard there. It's called Kirchliar. Right, it's in Derbent. Has the graves of 40 Sahaba there. So
Okay,
40 Sahaba are buried there. 40 people who were alive during the time of the Prophet, they are buried there. That's how early we're talking.
well, it's such a early and central part of Islamic history that that we're talking about here. From back then, we've had an Islamic presence in the Caucasus,
Yeah.
and yet I guess it's like we just don't. It's not commonly understood. We know we were in Syria and Egypt, and and advancing into Persia.
Mhm.
But that's so interesting that within the first 100 years of Islam, we had a real presence in history.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And yeah,
Can I ask just on this point as well, just on the geography point, to what extent do you think it influenced the culture of the Muslims of the Caucasus and the northern Caucasus, people like Chechens and Ingvesh and Dagestanis, this
Yeah.
geography? Because usually, like for example, if we take Afghanistan, people would say that the mountainous nature of Afghanistan and how it's sort of a bit more isolated from other parts of Central Asia created a culture that's a bit more insular and tribal, and to a certain extent that to a very large extent, you would say that's determined the nature of Afghanistan up until today, and made the Pashtuns are known to be, I guess, a conservative tribal people, and you can very easily relate that to geography. And when I see Chechens and Ingvesh, I don't hear about liberal Chechen and English. You know what I mean? And to a certain extent, I guess that's just demography. You hear about liberal Pakistanis, but there's also like 240 million in Pakistan, and how many, God knows how many in the diaspora. So part of that, I guess, is just numbers. But how did that geography influence the culture? Yeah.
Yeah. No, 100% definitely agree. I would say the terrain has really shaped us to be who we are. Specifically, I'm going to talk about us, the Vainas, Chechen English people. Our whole kind of I won't say spirit. I don't really like that word, too much religious connotation. But let's say like the maybe that English, let's call it spirit anyway. English Chechen spirit is really molded by the mountain, rugged terrain, difficult life, isolation, tribal societies.
Yeah. Unique identity.
Intertribal conflict, because of that, like if you're always fighting, for example, you need to be a good fighter.
100%.
You don't grow soft. Life is tough. Like kind of that cycle of like if you even look at the early Chinese empires and the steppe people. Every time the steppe people they're rugged, hard people. The kind of urban Chinese people grow soft. The steppe people come in, they take over, they get comfortable. Over time, they become soft. A new kind of hard steppe people come in, take over, and that cycle kind of repeats itself.
Exactly that, and that's like actually just basic sociology that even Ibn Khaldun talks about. That's just rise and fall, and exactly like you mentioned, the steppe people, like the Mongols and the Turks in Central Asia, were continuously coming out, and every time they'd leave their steppes, they'd conquer. But good. Yeah. Exactly that.
Same thing. I would say, every time I come across mountain people, I can relate. I feel like I have a connection because we have
I've seen you do that.
Mindset.
I've seen it happen.
Yeah. So I'd come to like a Pashtun or some other kind of tribal people, not tribal people as well, but mountain people specifically.
Yeah.
We have similar understanding. We have a similar way of life. Similar. The word we use adat is like not ethics, manners, maybe mannerisms, customs. Exactly. Yeah, very similar. Very overlapping because that I feel like I get along quite well with them.
Of course.
But that's all due to
I don't know if you know this, but myself and Hasan were in Kyrgyzstan together in Central Asia, and half of that great holiday, and that half of that country is mountains, and it's just seeing Hasan up in the mountains talking to Kyrgyz people like Zdravstvuyte. I don't know. No, it was interesting. I could see that. Okay, like it was very obvious that Hasan had a better connection with these people than the rest of us who were Pakistanis and Arabs. And like I remember Hasan you becoming best friends with one of our tour guides, and there was like this I thought there was a really nice connection between you guys. MashaAllah, tabarakallah, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so that just comes down to geography, as you mentioned. So definitely an important factor.
Yeah.
Geography, and I feel as well like a lot of these nations, they've had similar challenges and struggles. Like we mentioned, Afghanistan. Afghanistan has had, so many empires that have tried to take that land and that people. It's the same in, the likes of the Northern Caucasus. So that is a very, very similar struggle there as well. In that spirit of resistance.
Mm. Yeah, and just going back to kind of the origins of Islam in the North Caucasus, like I mentioned, that gateway, once you kind of get Derbent, you have access to the North Caucasus, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But like I mentioned, like for example, specifically the Chechen English people, right? We're in the mountains. Derbent, and then kind of more north you go is the lowlands, the flatlands, right? Very good farming land, more settled people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Word can spread fast there. Religion spreads fast there. Trade goes well there. In the mountains is a lot slower, right?
Mm-hmm.
So people are slower to adapt to changes because of the isolation, right? It's the exact same reason why our culture maybe or our languages are preserved is because we're not really mixing as much. People, traders aren't coming into the mountains as much. So because of that, obviously religion kind of, like I said, goes through Dagestan, Derbent area a lot earlier, a lot faster than Chechen English people. But eventually, there it does get there slowly and slowly.
I'm just
And
looking at
the kind of pagan religion kind of gets out with it in with the new.
That's so interesting because I just opened up the map while you were speaking on Google Maps here, and it's almost like a corridor here across the East Caucasus. You have it goes Iraq, Iran into Azerbaijan on the Caspian Sea, and then there's Russia comes down here around the west part of the Caucasus. It comes around Georgia and Armenia down into Azerbaijan, and that part of Russia is obviously Dagestan and Chechnya. So you can sort of see like a Muslim corridor here that they went around these mountains up.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah, and there's been a Muslim presence there there was a Muslim presence there for quite a long time. I was actually reading something interesting. Whether it's true or not it is disputed, but I was reading some sources saying even Harun al-Rashid, one of the righteous Khalifas, he was actually spent some time in Derbent, came over, built up some of the the infrastructure, kind of helped out the people and stuff. So I don't know if that's true. I need to do some further research. Some people say the source is good. Some people dispute it. But just another point, towards showing the presence of Islam in the region. We're talking big figures here, like Harun al-Rashid, the Sahabas. So it's been there for a long time. Yeah.
It's interesting, I guess, just based on what you're saying on the Caucasus. It's actually, if you think about it, such a cradle of religion, because Armenia and Georgia, who are right next door, were very early Christian states. And Georgia, I don't know about Armenia, but Georgia for now has a very Christian identity, and so it's interesting, I guess, how early these countries go back into the history of both religions, Christianity and Islam. It's essential in its cauldron almost.
Yeah, Armenia is the same. There's a whole denomination of Christianity, the Armenian Church, the Armenian Orthodox.
Yeah,
they're one of the one of the denominations that have a place. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Armenian Orthodox Church has a part in that. So it's a very, very early Christianity, very early Islam as well.
That's fun.
Yeah, so I suppose shifting then to a little bit more recent history. Can you talk a bit about the Russian Empire, and I suppose particularly that struggle that's come about since the start of the Russian Empire, kind of from like the 16th century, and what impact that started to have on the region?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, how did they come into the Caucasus? What's the story there?
So obviously during the periods that we were just discussing, the time of the early entry of Islam into the Caucasus, the Russian Empire wasn't an empire, let's just say. The Russians, or at the time they were known the Kievan Rus, were just a few princedoms, a few cities few city-states, essentially, right? You had Kiev, you had Moscow, you had a few other settlements, right? And, that really started to change during the, the 15th, 16th, more 16th, 17th century. And a large shift happened, I would say, during the time of Peter the Great. If you've heard of Peter the Great, I'm sure all the Civ players are quite familiar with Peter the Great. Essentially, he comes in and he's a big reformist. Russia was obviously, it was present at the time, but it wasn't a major player. It wasn't a major player in European politics. And they were lacking in a lot of societal aspects. They were behind on agriculture, infrastructure, all of these different, aspects of society. He comes in, he doesn't like the way things are. He likes what he sees in Europe, starts to copy it, sends out ambassadors, sends out different, different people to, go around Europe, collect information, bring it back, implements it into Russia. So really quickly, Russia, starts to really build up itself. He's a big, supporter, big fan of Navy. So from when he comes in, there's no Russian Navy. A few years later, he has the largest fleet, right? So once he kind of comes in, a lot of obviously societal aspects, infrastructure, agriculture takes on. But he takes on a lot of ideas as well, a lot of European philosophies.
Yeah.
One of them being what? Colonialism.
Of course,
that kind of mindset, expansionist mindset.
Yeah,
so
it's interesting that you mentioned that because from what I understand, for a long time, or at least I don't know for how long, but certainly during the later parts of the Russian Empire, they had a very francophone culture among the elites. The elites would learn French and study, like you were saying, Western philosophy. So it's a good point. I don't know the answer, but to what extent did their sort of colonial energy derive from the adoption of traditional European norms at the time? I don't know traditional, but colonial norms at the time. So that's an interesting point.
Yeah, based on my readings, I say quite a lot. Because once he himself went into Europe, he studied some naval bases, some naval academies, got a lot of information, brought a lot back. And that's when you really start to see a change. Russia really starts to build itself. He names itself the Imperator.
Exactly. Yeah.
And a lot of conflicts start to arise. Conflicts with the Ottomans, the Europeans, the Poles, the Swedes during this time as well.
I think it's under him and his daughter Catherine the Great that they expanded to the Baltics, expanded like further past Europe, further east. Is that right? Yeah.
Catherine is a. I'll get to her. There's actually quite a lot of interesting points in regards to her and the relation to the Caucasus. But you're right. Yeah, they did really start expanding to the Baltic. That's when they kind of, like I mentioned, when they start building up their navy, they didn't really have access to the sea. So they kind of expanded towards the sea, and they founded a city there. You may know it's called St. Petersburg.
Of course.
That's how that was founded. Peter the Great expanded towards the Baltic Sea, built his settlement there, moved his capital there as well.
Well, because previously their entire north coast is pretty much ice during most of the year, so it was obviously very strategic for them to now have access to the Baltics and therefore the sea, and therefore be a naval
become an actual naval player.
Exactly. Geography,
and so like that kind of mindset, that like you mentioned, going over to learning that or importing that European culture, mindset, philosophy, that kind of obviously passed down to his son, grandson, etc. And then eventually we get to an interesting figure. Like you touched on her name, Catherine the Great. And she comes in, right? Interesting point, first of all, she's not Russian.
Oh, really?
She's actually German, a German descent.
Oh, well.
She was a German noblewoman, her family German nobility or Prussian nobility, essentially German.
Yeah.
She kind of gets married to Peter III. And that's kind of how she gets her in. She eventually overthrows him, becomes the empress She's not Russian at all, but she does come in. She does really adopt the way of the Russians. She really likes it there, language, culture, all of that stuff. Plus European philosophy. She's a big fan of Voltaire, stuff
Really?
like that. Yeah.
Classic Enlightenment thinker. Yeah.
And she was known to be quite promiscuous, but that aside. So during her time, she kind of obviously continues to expand the empire, the Russian Empire. And they really start to come into contact with a lot of Muslim lands during this time. First of all, on the way to the Caucasus, one of the first places you come across is Crimea. Crimea, if you're not aware of the geography, Crimea it's almost like an island. Call it like a peninsula of sorts in the Black Sea, the north coast of the Black Sea, right? And this has been a Muslim lands for quite a while. At this time, it was under the Ottoman Empire, actually. So the Ottomans controlled it, and at that time, actually, the Black Sea was more of a Muslim lake of sorts. On the north side, you had the Crimeans, who were Muslim under Ottoman control. On the east, you had Circassian cities, Circassian settlements, Muslims. Again, throughout all that coast, Muslim lands. On the south, you're already into Middle East, Anatolia, Muslim lands. So the Muslims control the Black Sea. They control the Black Sea itself. They control the entrance into the Black Sea through the Bosphorus. So it's a Muslim lake at this point, right? So as the Russians start to expand, they come in contact with Crimea, they come in contact with the Ottomans, and they obviously, even before they got to Crimea, there was already the Russo-Turkish war, as they call it, right? Eventually culminates, you have the Crimean War. The Russian Empire eventually take control of it in 1783, I want to say. And this is probably one of the first times where Russia, or the Russians, are controlling land inhabited by Muslims. And obviously, quite different, right? Quite different.
It's quite a milestone. Yeah.
Quite a milestone, but even the way in which they now have to operate and control these lands is completely different. The people are different, their mindsets are different, their culture is different, right?
Have to start learning about Islam, the Russians. And it's probably a milestone in the development of Russian Orientalism. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the things that you see kind of pick up here or kind of come to fruition during this time is during Catherine's time, they come up with this kind of one of the first policies, let's say Muslim policies. And it's called the Muslim Spiritual Assembly.
Oh, I've heard about this, yeah.
You've heard about this, yeah. So that kind of idea comes into play. I think the first time they kind of started discussing it was 1788. So we're saying 1783 they took over Crimea. 1788 they start coming up with these ideas. And around 1794 they start to really implement these policies in Crimea. As we go on, obviously, as I mentioned, they kind of go into the North Caucasus as well. These policies develop, they try to implement them as well. Essentially, what these policies are is a way to control, is for the Russian state to control the Muslim inhabitants. And there are a few kind of central ideas, right? One of the main ones is the use of the scholarly class to control the ordinary people, right? And when I was reading this quite a while ago, reading about these policies, it was really interesting because I realized that this was the kind of the starting point for where we are today. The policies that are in place today, the strategy, the Muslim strategy that they have in place today, this was the start of it. They
learned about Muslims from the Caucasus, and even there's that book I've recommended to you before. It's called Islam After Communism, and he actually specifically says that by the time Russia conquered Central Asia, they already had a long history of Islam because of the Caucasus. So it makes absolute sense that they developed their Muslim policy based on the Caucasus, which, if I'm following the timeline correctly, it was only conquered 18th to 19th century. you know?
Yeah. So yeah, I'll move into that. So
Yeah.
essentially, there was conflict. Obviously, they took Crimea, they took control of it in 1783, right? But there's also back and forth between them and the Ottomans. Them getting in, them getting pushed back, them getting in, them getting pushed back. So you had some of the earliest figures in resisting the Russian, say the Russian imperial.
Mm-hmm.
The colonists, let's call them.
Yeah.
One of the earliest figures in the Caucasus you have is a guy who's not as well known. His name is Sheikh Mansour. And Sheikh Mansour was a Chechen. Studied in, obviously during this time, like I mentioned, we have the Islam. He studied in Dagestan. So Dagestan was actually a hotspot for a lot of Sufi tariqas at the time.
Okay, well,
Naqshbandis, etc., different tariqas. So a lot of people go there, study, go back out. Same with him. Sheikh Mansour was in Dagestan. I think around 18 years old. He went over, studied, spent a good few years there studying. Went back to Chechen, started doing a lot of da'wah. Always at the time, people were obviously some depend. Like I said, it's tribal, so it varies from tribe to tribe. Some may be Muslims, some may be Jahil, some may be pagans still, right? So he spent a lot of time doing da'wah in the early days.
Okay, wow.
Kind of calling people to Islam, to stick to the Sharia, kind of promoting that. And he was one of the first to kind of have an armed struggle against the Russian Empire, right? And so he's probably around 1760. He was born around then, so around 1780s, 1790s is when he would have been active. And he quite successful in certain elements, obviously bringing Islam to the Chechen people. Obviously he was there before, but kind of reinforcing that, calling them to the Sharia, stuff like that. He had obviously troops and armies, not only Chechens and English, Dagestanis, Kumiks. Kumiks are a Turkic ethnicity within Dagestan.
Really? Wow, okay.
Yeah, just one of the ethnicities.
Bringing a lot of different people together in the Caucasus, a lot of different Muslim ethnic groups, different backgrounds, but and he's doing dawah as well. So he's quite a pluralistic, almost Islamic leader of the Northern Caucasus.
Exactly. Yeah. And he was active in that Chechnya, Ingush, kind of that sort of lowland area, Dagestan, these different towns and stuff. Was active in Circassia as well. Moved over to Circassia once. He kind of got pushed out of Chechnya Ingushetia by the Russians at the time. But he was in Circassia. Eventually, gets captured in an Ottoman fort. The Russians lay siege to an Ottoman fort. He gets captured. He gets life sentence, dies in captivity 3 years later. But he's an interesting one because I wanted to bring him up first, so I one of the first to do it.
Yeah.
Not known at all, really.
Yeah.
He's like one of the early leaders of the Caucasus Islamic resistance against the Russian Empire. So he's quite central but unknown.
Exactly, yeah. A lot of people know the likes of, Imam Shamil, very popular.
Exactly.
Most people know him. This was the predecessor. And he was an interesting guy as well. He big, tall guy, pale, giant guy. They say I was reading something about Imam Shamil was saying, because Imam Shamil wasn't around at his time, but some of the people that were his followers were around during Sheikh Mansour's time, and they were saying he was so big, if he was in a crowd, you would think that he's sitting on a horse.
Okay.
So a really interesting figure. Just wanted to bring him to light, kind of give him the props, let people know about him as well. But he was a big figure as well. Yeah, Allah yarhamu. Then obviously we know likes of Imam Shamil. Before him there was Hamza Bek, Kazimullah. These are guys who were the leaders of Shamil. They didn't obviously last as long, but Imam Shamil was obviously a long time struggler against Russian occupation, Imperial Russia. But during this time, right, so Imam Shamil is active from around, say, 1820s, 30s to the 50s. 20, 30 years he's active fighting against the Russians. So during this time, the Russian empire, kind of circling back to those policies, they have two kind of, let's say, strategies. They obviously have the military side, and then they have the religious policy side, right? And focusing on the religious policies for a second, right? They kind of developed it, like we mentioned, once they came into contact with the Muslims in Crimea, but they really continued to push it once they got into the Caucasus. They're trying to control the people. These people are causing them a lot of problems, 30, 40, 50 years of fighting. It's a headache. It's a lot of resources. It's expensive.
Mhm.
They need to get
Yeah.
hold of these peoples. So this one of the strategies they employ is controlling the people through religious means.
Mhm.
And I was reading, it's quite interesting. There was a governor of the Caucasus at the time, and he kind of proposes this idea to implement this policy within the Caucasus, right? And this guy was active during some of the campaigns in Persia. So at the same time, they were campaigning in Persia, right? In Tabriz. We've heard Tabriz, right?
Mhm.
City Tabriz, right? And this governor, during his time there, he comes across this, call him Imam. His name was Mir Fatah, I think Mir Fatih. And this guy helped him during his time in Tabriz in Persia, right? This guy was a collaborator with the Russians
Oh my
in
God.
Persia.
Mm.
Wait, so he's helping who, sorry?
He's helping the Russians. So he's helping this governor during his time there. He was helping them when they were invading.
Okay, well.
And so this guy connects with this Mir Fatah guy, wants to bring him over to kind of help implement this. Essentially set him up as the head imam. The people listen to him because he's on their payroll, and he has he's working collaborating with them. They're able to then de facto control the people, right?
It's like what you mentioned earlier, how Catherine set up the Muslim Spiritual Assembly, and how that's a means of organizing and controlling the religion by controlling the religious figures. And that's something that's up until now, like, one of the facts of Islam in the modern period is that, in a lot of countries, and even during colonialism and the Russian Empire, by controlling the religious elite, you have control of the people. So you have state imams in a lot of Muslim countries, and that's actually totally antithetical to the history of a healthy, pluralistic Islam that is connected to the people rather than, being imposed upon them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that, like I said, that policy, that Muslim Spiritual Assembly was a start, expands into the Caucasus. This policies are then try to implement them in the Caucasus. But the funny thing is, so they brought this guy in. He has a list of demands. He wants land. He wants wealth. He wants power. He has his whole list of demands. And they give it a good few years. They really try. But the funny thing is, because this was, like I mentioned, the first time Russia kind of came across Muslims, they didn't realize that there were different types of Muslims. This guy was a Shia. And the population of the Caucasus, the North Caucasus, they were Sunni. So nobody's going to listen to this guy. And that's kind of one of the reasons why that first attempt kind of flopped. One thing, though, I read that was interesting, though, was one thing this guy did succeed in was actually, because at the time, like I mentioned, Derbent, a lot of mixing. There were Shia populations in the region as well. Because obviously you had the Safavids were active at the time, the 15th century, 16th century. So you did have a lot of mixing there, some Shia population there. He did actually, during the times of the military campaigns ongoing at the same time, the struggle with Imam Shamil. Yeah. This Mir Fatah guy did succeed in really calming down the Shia populations, right? The Sunni guys are not listening to him, they're fighting. The Shia populations, he kind of got them under control because they're going to listen to him, he's their guy. And he actually convinced them to fight with Russia.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
The Shia population of the Caucasus, or are you talking about?
Sorry?
You're talking about the Shia population of the Caucasus?
Yeah.
Is that like perhaps Azerbaijan today?
Yeah. It'd be the extension of it, yeah. But like I mentioned, like you had the Safavids and stuff at the time, so you would have the Shah Shah Ismail and his efforts to kind of push Shiism kind of spread into that region, Azerbaijan, Shia today. And it obviously leaks into Dagestan, Derbent. It's the passageway, it's the gateway to the Caucasus. So you did have populations there.
You had Shia populations in the northern Caucasus, but not really anymore.
No, you still have pockets. You still have pockets. Like I was reading the demographic breakdown of Derbent, for example, in the 19th century. There was a good percentage of them were Shia, like, so there were Shia populations there. Yeah,
that's very interesting, and it's interesting as well. You mentioned the Safavids because the Safavids were from the Caucasus. They were Azerbaijan, like they were Azeri. They're the ones who created the modern, Shia Iranian experience. So that's very very interesting.
Yeah. So they kind of tried that out. That didn't work for the reasons I mentioned. But these are, like I mentioned, these are the roots for the policies that we see in place today. Mm-hmm. They realized, obviously, that them bringing in someone from an outsider, people are not going to listen to him. They're bringing in a Persian guy. The locals are not going to listen to him. What do they learn? Okay, we need someone that's local. Mm-hmm. We need one of them to be able to lead them, to control them. They learned that. What do you see today? What do you see in Central Asia? So, like I mentioned, this was the root. This is where this is their testing grounds for control of Muslim lands. And we can see it today in the Caucasus and the other Muslim lands.
It's so interesting you mentioned that, because that just matches up with, a lot of other, colonial empires, Britain and France. If you look at, oftentimes you look at their policies on Muslims today and their understanding, it does have a lot of Orientalist roots. They went to the Middle East and they used their first impressions of Muslims to develop their body of Orientalist knowledge. Yeah. And the European relationship with knowledge is that it's something that's to be instrumentalized and used, and that's why for them, knowledge is power, which I think is quite different to a healthy understanding, and most certainly the Islamic understanding. When knowledge is something that's developmental and oftentimes spiritual, and it's again understanding this history and how the Russia, which is a country that up until now has massive interactions with Islam, developed its policy set, its early policy set on Muslims in the Caucasus. That's actually that's so important and interesting.
Yeah. It's very relevant actually, because I mean, like you guys are saying, we literally see this today. So it's interesting to hear kind of how far back this kind of strategy goes, and how it's been applied in the Caucasus and now in so many other areas that where Muslims are now.
Exactly. Another interesting point there before we move on was in the early stages of this kind of Muslim spiritual assembly, this strategy that they try to employ, and obviously during the time of Catherine, one of her kind of ways of going about things was kind of a pacifist type of way. Not say passive, let's say an active way of doing things. Things would naturally develop, right? When they were in the Caucasus, right, they assumed that the Russian culture would overpower the religion and the culture of the Caucasus people. So because of that, they would kind of just, let things be. Eventually, they realized that, this is actually not going to happen, right? And this is when they changed their policy on the way in which they allow the people to live by the religion. What do I mean by that? The way in which, for example, they let the Sharia govern the people. Mm-hmm. When they took a step back and let people do the things the way they wanted, obviously they ruled by Sharia. Yeah, the culture was the culture of Islam, the Sunnah, etc. Things didn't change. They switched up. They realized that they could not let the Sharia, the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to govern the way people live. This is very important. If they wanted to change the way people thought, they wanted to change the culture of the people, they wanted to impose their own culture on the natives, they could not let Sharia govern the way people lived. So they really started to limit it. They limited Sharia to spiritual affairs only. So they essentially separated religion and government.
That's so interesting that you mentioned that, because again, that's totally alien to Islam. We don't have these distinctions between religion and philosophy, religion and politics. It's a very holistic experience, and it's again a way of. This is an example of them imposing their understanding of the world, segmenting things. Number one, and number two, using that to enforce their authority. And again, it's like the importance of getting rid of the Sharia. So at the end of the day, the Sharia is a moral paradigm, and under this, first of all, it's totally. If you want your paradigm there, then obviously you're going to be hostile to the Sharia. You want your Russian culture, then you have to get rid of the existing paradigm that exists. And our paradigm, like I said, it's a moral one. It's an important distinction to make, that what they might be trying to impose their culture and their paradigm might have its benefits, but ours is a paradigm based in morality. Number one, and number two is under that system, that worldview. Allah is the sovereign. Allah is the person who has authority over you. And so in order to remove like Allah's authority over us, then they had to get rid of the Sharia. So that's how they implemented their own power, subhanAllah. So it's an important philosophical point that to highlight. And this is something that Wal Halak is talking about these days. One of the critiques of the state is that under any state, Allah is not the final sovereign, and this is a real important question for us to ask ourselves today. How can we be truly follow a holistic moral system of Islam when in most cases across the world the state is the final arbiter of morality. And this is what we're seeing here is the construction of the modern paradigm being imposed upon the Muslims by the Russians. So it's a very interesting, important time. This period you're talking about with Catherine the Great and the imposition of the Russian Empire upon the Muslims. Sorry, just a little point, but yeah.
No, yeah, definitely 100%. Here really right on the nail on the head there.
And sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, as I mentioned, these kind of religious policies, military, and at the same time, the military kind of action, the conflicts ongoing as well, and that kind of continues on. Imam Shamil is kind of the last real organized resistance.
Yeah,
and that ends in 1859 when he surrenders. Wow. He eventually dies in 71 in Mecca. Or Medina. I think he's buried in Jannah. I think he got buried in Jannah in Medina.
So those are sort of like the bookends of the Russian entrance into the Caucasus. We got Sheikh Mansour starting that initial resistance, the opening chapter, and then I suppose Imam Shamil is like the closing. Not to say that the resistance has ended, but just in terms of that period.
A real organized, large scale resistance probably ended with Imam Shamil. And Imam Shamil, that's a whole different topic. That's a long time to go into that. Obviously, he was active for a long time.
The podcast.
But one thing I will mention, one of his qualms, one of his real things that he mentioned, he was the disappointment he had, and this kind of relates to nowadays with the Ottomans, the Muslims at the time, the Muslim states at the time. He was in conflict with them for 30 years, and these guys didn't support him. So when he surrenders in 59, he's taken and he's actually given like an honorary exile. They call it. So he was living in Mecca, somewhere in Petersburg or wherever it was. He was eventually granted permission to go do Hajj. That's why he dies in Mecca or Medina or wherever it was. And on his way there, he's actually greeted by the Ottoman envoy. They kind of welcome him, and because everyone knows him at this point. The Ottomans are really familiar with the situation in the Caucasus because they had the conflicts with the Russians as well. And there was like this kind of story, whether it's true or not. He's like, what would you like? He goes, no, I don't need anything from you now. You should have back then. I needed you then. You weren't there. And I feel like that's kind of similar to the situation in Palestine we have today with Muslim states. I just wanted to mention that one last thing there.
That's a very good point. Just back there, Hasan, subhanAllah. And it's very interesting that he died in Makkah, Medina. It's quite an honor to be defeated, but somehow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted him to die in such a place that He brought him close to the home of Islam. That's may Allah bless him and be pleased with him.
No, yeah, absolutely. What kind of effect, coming to a little bit more modern times now? We saw the rise of communism, particularly in Russia and in that region. Something I think we've touched on a bit in the past in previous podcasts as well, but more so in the context of Muslims within Europe and so on. What kind of impact has that had in the Caucasus, would you say?
Yeah, I would say very, very big effect, and we still see the remnants of it today. Like Hasan mentioned, me and him were in Kyrgyzstan, and we saw the remnants of it 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's still really fresh in the memories of all of the Muslims who were under the Russians or the Soviet Union. Obviously, as we know, the communists, so the Bolshevik party, come into power in 1917 to overthrow the monarchy, right? The Romanov family. Before that, obviously, Russia had continued to expand, took over the Caucasus, moved into Persian area, conflict into Anatolia, trying to get into Anatolia, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, taking over all these lands and kind of Russified them in a sense, right? Once the Bolsheviks came in, the communists came in, they obviously inherited all of that land, right? And in doing so, inherited a lot of control over Muslim lands. And obviously, we're familiar with communism and its opposition to religion, right? So Muslims living under their control, under the communist sphere, they were persecuted, of course. They weren't allowed to openly practice religion. There was no, let's call it, religious infrastructure. The masajid, madrasas, all this was banned, was outlawed. And so, Muslims, because we, like you mentioned, we don't separate life or politics or work or life from religion. It's a holistic view. We feel it the most.
Exactly.
Do you get me? When that becomes repressed, such a big part of our identity becomes repressed, right?
Yeah.
And so we really felt the effects of that from the onset, from the introduction of communism, and obviously because of that, even like I mentioned, Shamil was the last organized resistance in the Caucasus, right? But there was still resistance within the Caucasus people. We're not ones to kind of bend the knee. Continuously, there's always been skirmishes, small resistance, individuals. They're called bricks. These guys would terrorize raid Russian lands, banks, trains, convoys, everything. And so that resistance continued into the Soviet times, right? And there's a lot of history, like particularly with let's say with the Chechen Ingush people, right, the North Caucasus. A date which is really solidified, really in the memory of all of the Vainakh people, is the 23rd of February, 1944. And this date was, the Russians called it Operation Lentil, right? What this was the forced deportation of the particularly Chechen Ingush people, but Muslims in the Caucasus in general, right? So not just the Chechen Ingush, Crimean Muslims as well got deported. And they were forced deportation to foreign lands, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Siberia, right? A forced removal of not just a portion or a group of the Vainakh people or the Crimean people, all of them. So imagine every single person living in Chechnya, Ingushetia at the time, forced deportation, killed, slaughtered. Yeah. Whoever couldn't be forced deported was killed on the spot.
ethnic cleansing.
And the reason for this was the reason that the Soviet Union gave, or Stalin gave, was that he said the Chechen English people collaborate with the Nazis.
Right.
So obviously we know that 1940, Operation Barbarossa, Nazis invade Russia, right? One of the goals, if you actually look at the map of the invasion, is they don't go straight into the heartland of Russia. They get in and they go straight south to the Caucasus.
Okay, well.
And the reason they do that is because of the oil fields
in
the Caucasus, in Azerbaijan, in Baku. Baku is one of the first actually oil fields in the world. It was in Baku in the 19th century, 18 something or 17 something. One of the first oil refineries was in Baku, Azerbaijan. They make a way down straight south. 1942, they get into the Caucasus.